Moving on to our guest speaker tonight, ROSEMARY Cadden, and her talk is entitled Fact and Fiction Intertwine the Stories of Explorer John McDouall Stuart. Moving on to our guest speaker tonight, ROSEMARY Cadden, and her talk is entitled Fact and Fiction Intertwine the Stories of Explorer John McDouall Stuart. John, as a brief introduction, John McDouall Stuart was born at Dysart, which is located due north of Edinburgh, just across the Firth of Forth. He arrived in South Australia in January 1839 at the age of 23. In 1858, he undertook the first of 6 expeditions into the centre of Australia and beyond. Previously, he had gone on expeditions with Charles Stuart. His route to the top end, as it was termed, was later used for the Overland Telegraph Line and the route of the original Ghan railway line. Around 150 years later, our speaker, journalist ROSEMARY Cadden, who also comes from, I say here Dysart, but she says she comes from, what's it called? Kirkcaldy, which is right next door, and Dysart is now really a suburb of Kirkcaldy. ROSEMARY followed McDouall Stuart's tracks. Tonight she will relate their respective experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, is this working? Oh, it's working, isn't it? Okay. That means I can wander about as I'm wont to do. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I really expected to say, can we all gather in a little group and just have a chat? So I'm really pleased that so many of you have turned up tonight. Well done. Now, I have to say I was a little bit daunted to accept this invitation to speak here, because normally I speak to groups who want to know about road trips or whatever. And I thought, oh, these people, they all know their stuff about history. And so I felt a bit daunted. And so I've got to say something about the title of this talk. Let me get my specs on. Fact and fiction intertwined throughout the stories of explorer John McDouall Stuart. Now, I see from my emails that I chose that title in December last year, and I'm now thinking maybe I'd had a couple of wines to celebrate Christmas before I suggested that. Anyway, I must have had a rush of blood to the brain or something when I came up with that. Very brave of me in this vaunted audience. Very brave. Or, as they were wont to say on Yes Minister, courageous move. Okay, so that is a big question, isn't it? How do we tell the difference between fact and fiction when we look at history? And I'm sure historians and authors, and there's a lot of you around here tonight, over decades have come to blows over this type of question because, there's so many ifs and buts about it all, isn't there? Now, a fact, I've got this written down here, a fact that's indisputable can be disputed and found not to be true at all. And we all know that some science fiction has got horribly close to reality, hasn't it? So fact and fiction, that's really shorthand for a whole lot of words and phrases, and very appropriate in this time of the globe. Other terms are missing moments in history, myths, misconceptions, misinformation, disinformation, and of course downright lies. Okay, so all of that can be put into what I'm going to kind of talk about tonight. And I said fact and fiction intertwine. I'm wondering if maybe that should actually be blend, because intertwine, that sounds like that you can distinctly differentiate between fact and fiction, and I think you can't. You know this, when I've got my glasses on, I can't see you. So I'm going to have to take them on and off all the time. Okay, so anyway, never mind intertwining or even blending. I often tie myself up in knots when I'm talking about this subject. And I've given quite a few talks about fake news and so on since I wrote the book, because I just find it really quite fascinating. My talk tonight and I hope you're not going to be disappointed, doesn't come up with any answers, okay? No set conclusions. I've always been this way. I wrote the same thing in the introduction to my book. I wrote something along the lines of, this book doesn't have the answers. And I'm hoping that suits you, the reader, when you get to the last page to find not only are there no answers, but you've got even more questions to ponder. Now, I think that's really good. You know, I think I'm going to, when I stop wanting to learn, I'm falling apart here. Can you still hear me? That's probably because I've got a loud voice. Eh? Oh, there we go. So anyway, where was I? Actually, I've told my first lie. That's not strictly true. I've not always been this way, and I blame it all on the road trip that I made and the research that I did over the next 8 years, because I used to think I knew it all, well, more or less. So when I went on the road trip through the centre of Australia to follow the tracks of Now, I know that you said McDouall Stuart, and that's what I used to always say as well. And then at the launch of my book last year, this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, and that was a really nice launch, but it's not McDowell, it's McDouall. She was Australian, I'm Scottish, you know. And I thought, I wonder if she's right. You know, McDowell is a bit posh sounding, isn't it, compared to McDouall. Anyway, I rang my friend who lives in Dysart, and I said to her, can you do a little straw poll in Dysart? Tell me, is it McDowell or is it McDouall? Anyway, she's a nurse, and it was during COVID, and so she had all these, every time anyone came in for the vaccination, she'd say, is it John McDowell Stuart or John McDouall Stuart? And apparently it is McDouall, so there we go, I had it wrong all along. Okay, so anyway, when I started on my road trip, I thought I had a very simple goal in life. I was going to follow this man who comes from the same region as me, a man who, you know, was the first European to go through the centre of Australia, and I thought he's the perfect person to help me work out a little bit more, learn a little bit more about this country that I now call home. That's what I thought. That was my goal. I thought it was a fairly straightforward goal, but I thought I knew lots already. I didn't know I was going to be finding out so much more. And I thought that if I didn't know the answer, all I had to do was a bit of research, read a lot, and then I could get my facts straight. That's what I thought. Okay, I reckon that's why it took me 8 years after I did the road trip, I know. 8 years to finally finish the book, because I had to come to grips with the reality that I wasn't going to find the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I was just going to keep finding people that were disagreeing with each other and all that sort of thing. So I thought, what am I going to do here? And then I realised that that's much more fun. It's much more interesting, isn't it? I just thought, no, that's why all these historians love doing what they're doing, because you're like a bit of a detective, you know, you're trying to get evidence and prove things. And so I thought I was going to, as I say, find the truth about John McDouall Stuart, about colonisation, and I didn't. In fact, I even found that I was a bit confused about myself in the end. So anyway. So I realised that my own biases and my own experiences and my background did influence what I saw, what I listened to, what I remembered, what I believed and what I paid attention to. And so it became, and I must admit, I've had a great time, an absolute great time doing all that research. It's all new to me. I'm sure this is nothing new to you. I'm sure you're all going, yeah, of course, of course. But to me, I did think that history was set in stone. I had to realise that that's not the case. And in the beginning, I was annoyed, to say the least, when I came across facts and then read something else that seemed to disprove those facts. But slowly, I realised that I was going to have fun with this. So let me tell you a little bit about me and the origins of the book. So as you're obviously you're aware now, I'm not a historian or a researcher. I'm a journalist from way back. I was a journalist in Scotland, and I continued being a journalist when I came to Australia. And in Australia, like lots of migrants, I wanted to learn a little bit more about Australia, about the history. And I probably know more about Australia than I do about Scotland. I was only 22 when I left Scotland, and history wasn't my thing, so, that's my excuse. So my interest in McDouall Stuart, as you've already heard, I come from the same area as McDouall Stuart. That's my first wee lie. I say I come from the same town, but as you already know, he came from Dysart, and I came from Kirkcaldy. So I'm going to show you something. Now that's the Forth Bridge. Okay, has anybody here been over the Forth Bridge? There's 3 bridges now going over the Firth of Forth. Try and see that after a few wines. Firth of Forth. Okay, so that's the Forth Bridge, and that goes over, as you know, as you've been told, from Edinburgh over to Fife. The Kingdom of Fife, by the way. We still call ourselves the Kingdom of Fife because it was once a kingdom. And I grew up in Kirkcaldy, and McDouall Stuart was born in Dysart. Dysart is now a suburb of Kirkcaldy. Dysart is let's just say, the pretty sibling. Kirkcaldy is the ugly sister, actually. Kirkcaldy has got linoleum factories, used to have linoleum factories in the middle of the town and coal mines at either end of the town. You can imagine how lots of tourists go there, not. Okay, but Dysart is gorgeous. This is Dysart, so that's the harbour. Dysart's got a harbour, and when I win the lottery, I'm going to buy one of those white houses there in the background. That's called Pan Haw, and that's Scottish for, it used to be a place where they used to collect salt, and that's where the panning comes into it. So, anyway, actually, McDouall Stuart and I both come from Fife. McDouall Stuart came out, he left Scotland in 1838, arrived here at the beginning of 1839. He was on one of the first boats to come out. I was on one of the last migrant boats to come out in 1975. Hey, we're meant to be together. I was 22, he was 23. Excuse me. He definitely was the man to come with me on the trip. So, I stuck with him. Now, Kirkcaldy, Fife in general, but Kirkcaldy in particular, the South Australia Company, that was getting people to come out here, must have had a marvellous marketing programme going. You might know some other famous people in Adelaide that come from Kirkcaldy. The elders, they come from Kirkcaldy. The 4 brothers and the 1 sister, they came out. I think 2 brothers came out. Excuse me, I'm playing with my ears. 2 brothers came out, and I think maybe a couple of them went back, and another 2 came out, and the sister came out. And we all know Elder Hall, and we know Elder Real Estate. Okay, who else? Sir Walter Watson Hughes, who was one of the benefactors for Adelaide University. He comes from Pittenweem, which is a little village on the outskirts of Kirkcaldy. He came out. He arrived in Adelaide in 1840, 2 years after McDouall Stuart. Okay, now, I don't know if you know this nice little bit of information, which I learned watching Who Do You Think You Are? Adam Goods is a descendant of Sir Walter. So, there you go. So, Walter never had any children of his own. He and his wife didn't have any children, but he did father a child. I think King I think the Aboriginal, I think King Billy or something, King Willie, I can't remember. But anyway, he fathered a child, and Adam Goods is a descendant of that child. I think it was a Coulthard, I think. I'm not 100% sure. Now, you won't find that information on the university website, actually. That's one of those missing bits of information. Peter Waite, the Waite Institute. He came from Kirkcaldy too. Yep. And I've got here, the Waite Institute was established in 1924 following a bequest of land, an Arbury House, by Peter Waite to the University of Adelaide. So there's just a few people from Kirkcaldy that came out to Adelaide, so there must have been a mad rush to come out here. Somebody I'm going to mention, you maybe not have heard of this guy, Robert Cox, I think, Robert Cox. Have you heard of him? Cox's Creek in the hills, and Cox's Creek became Bridgewater, the town. It was once called Cox's Creek. So that's named after Robert Cox. Now, he came out on the Buffalo in 1836. So he was one of the first settlers, Robert Cox. And the reason I mention him, I'm going to show you a photograph of him. Not the most handsome man in the universe. Yeah. Well, McDouall Stuart was no picture either, I can tell you. Okay, so Robert Cox, right. Now, the reason I've got him there is because I read up about him, because he was actually born in Dysart, round the corner from McDouall Stuart. Now, I've got here, I'm going to read this out. Having bought land in Adelaide, he was a very good man. Having bought land in Adelaide, he felt morally obliged to pay interest on 1/5 of the purchase price. I felt it my duty, he informed the local protector of Aborigines in 1838, so right at the beginning, to pay to the proper authorities for the use of the land. He denied that the money was a donation. He said, no, it was a just claim that the natives of this district have on me as an occupier of their lands. So people did know way, way back then about the fact that this was not empty land or free land. And he was one of the people. I think he might have been a Quaker, actually. I'm not 100% sure about that. Okay. I can't remember if I learned that story in the early days of getting to know the true story about the so-called proclamation and the missing letters patent, or whether I learned that later. But I do know that I should have known that story, considering I worked for Aboriginal organisations in South Australia. But I didn't. It didn't sink in. So the fact that the men who came out on the first boats to set up the colony, they totally ignored the decree by the king back in England that they couldn't just take over the land, and that the original occupants were the legitimate owners of the land. We're slowly getting that information coming through. In fact, not slowly. There's a fantastic museum down in Glenelg. Have you been to that one? That's all about the letters patent and the proclamation. If you've not, I really do suggest you go down there, because it tells a great story it's a combination of the Aboriginal story and the settler story, and it's a really nice, it's been done beautifully. So Robert Cox, he did interest me, but I stuck to McDouall Stuart. He was my man, partly because, well, it was an excuse to do the road trip. I don't think Robert Cox left the Adelaide Hills. So, I was going to follow McDouall Stuart right up through the centre, and that's what I did. I took a month to go up through the centre from Adelaide up to Darwin, and I had a 4-wheel drive and a swag, and I did it on my own, and I had a great time, I have to tell you, except when it rained, because I didn't have a tent. One of those things I didn't have. Okay, so anyway, so that's what I did that trip, and it was an amazing trip. But the other reason that I wanted to stick with him was that He was a bit of an underdog, and I'm sure a lot of you that know about McDouall Stuart would agree with me that he's unsung in many areas. He's not even that well known in South Australia, but interstate, everyone knows Burke and Wills, don't they? I'm going to talk about Burke and Wills in a wee minute. Anyway, I'm now going to tell you a wee story. What's that? Sturt Desert Pea. It's on teacups and tea towels and, I don't know, stained glass windows. It's everywhere, isn't it? It's beautiful. Look at it. What's that? That's the Stuart pea. Now, it's not as glorious as that one. That's true. But there we go. That's the Sturt pea. And I discovered that reading a book written by Valmay Hankel and her late husband about the Simpson Desert. And that's when it was first mentioned. I spent years trying to track that down because I didn't know the botanical name. I realise how important it is to know the botanical name, because I even went to the Botanic Gardens and they're going, nah, never heard of it, never heard of it. Anyway, it's there. So if you go to the gardens, and that's where I took that photograph, you go to the gardens on Hackney Road, you know, in front of the tram. So the last time I looked, there was a Sturt Desert pea and the Stuart pea, but they have over the years disappeared and come back again, so I'm not promising it's there if you go. See, I try not to tell lies, I try to tell the truth, I try to give you facts. But anyway, you might think that is not very attractive, but I had a close look at it. Look at the yellow bit. Now, I'm going to show you what it looks like, because I picked one. Don't tell anybody. This has been filmed, isn't it? Oh dear. Okay, so I picked one, and this is what I did with it. You put it on its side, like its beak is what sticks onto the branch, and the yellow bit is the flower. Looks just like a bird, doesn't it? Isn't it gorgeous? So I decided it was the logo for my blog. There you go. And when I used to say to people that I was writing about John McDouall Stuart, even in South Australia, people would go, oh yeah, I know him. Been to his house in Grange. And I go, no, that's Charles Sturt you're thinking of. Yep. So anyway, poor old McDouall Stuart, he gets hidden in the shadows of even Charles Sturt. But he wouldn't mind that, because he reckoned Charles Sturt was his mentor. Because as you've been told, he went on Charles Sturt's expedition into the centre when they were looking for the inland sea. So anyway, I'm sure he wouldn't mind. McDouall Stuart, I think, wasn't somebody who really looked for fame and fortune or even money. He was an explorer. I think he did it all because he was an explorer, which is just as well, because he didn't get much fame and fortune, did he? He didn't moan about it when he came with me on the trip. Okay, so the origins of the book. So at first I was going to do a blog, but that was done long after I did the road trip. So if I'm fictionalising at all, there's maybe a couple of areas where the road trip was fantastic. I took hundreds of photographs. I interviewed scores of people, maybe a dozen people, and I had a great time. But I realised I didn't know a lot about what I was seeing, and that's what I learned in the 8 years since. So this blog was done after I came back. To begin with, it was very simple. I used to send the photographs and the words back to my daughter, who put them online for me. That's how that went. So I did lots of interviews, and one of the ideas that I had was that I was going to compare my trip with his trip. And as I was going up there, I realised that I had to research an awful lot to actually get the comparison. Because, for example, even in the Flinders, I would see these beautiful old ruins of farmhouses, and I didn't know why there were ruins. I didn't know why they'd fallen down and weren't being used. And of course, I had to research all of that. So I wanted to dig deeper. And hey-ho, the book started to take shape. It's one of those genre-bending books. It's a road trip. It's a memoir of sorts, and it's got lots of history in there. Okay, it's called creative non-fiction, which actually gave me a lot of leeway. Sometimes it's called narrative non-fiction, and it's called narrative non-fiction because it's non-fiction, basically, but you're allowed to use some of the things that are used in a novel, and that's to make it more interesting. So my book has a plot. It's my trip going up there, and there's highs and lows, and anyone who's read the book will know that I had a few lows, mainly because I took risks and did silly things. But I have to say, I did not have one puncture, not one puncture. Could be because I drive very slowly, but I like to think it's because I was very careful. Okay, so there are also moments of tension, and I develop character, and I include dialogue. I'll talk about the dialogue in a minute. But let's look at the threads in the book and ponder whether I've written fact or fiction, and whether it's my fault if you think I've not told the truth. His expeditions, right? So he did 6 expeditions, and I broke the book up into 6 parts for the 6 expeditions, more or less. And lucky for me, his 6 expeditions, apart from the first one where he did squiggly lines all over South Australia, but apart from that, he'd get so far, he'd run out of water, he'd run out of horseshoes, he'd come back down again. Then next one, he would get a wee bit further again, get up a little bit further, come back down. So it made life easy for me. I just needed to follow basically his last expedition, because it included 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the way up there. So that was what I did. Now, I used his journals. Has anyone read any of his journals? They're all available. Well, they were all printed in the newspaper at the time. The 6th one's actually been produced in a book by the Friends of the State Library. So I used his journals, and I used newspaper articles. And because I was a journalist, I can say you can't always believe what you read in a newspaper. But I used the journals, and I used newspaper articles and reports to write about his expeditions. It's been written a number of times that he was no writer. He was, they're saying that that's one of the reasons why he wasn't as famous as other people. But there are some passages that, if those of you that do research back in those days, it's very flowery language sometimes, isn't it? The stuff that you read in the newspapers. There's no way I could beat that. So I used bits out of his journals when I was writing about his expedition. Now, some people might say, how do you know the journals weren't doctored? Well, I tried to read the originals, but the writing is so tiny, and a lot of it is about wind direction, and I was falling asleep as I was reading it, so anyway, but that's what I did. My trip, so I wrote about my trip, and I can't tell a lie. All the stories about me getting lost and getting into trouble, they're all true. I didn't make anything up in the book about my trip. I interviewed people, and the reason I included them in the book is because rather than me telling you about, for instance, pastoral stations, I interviewed a pastoralist, and it's his story. So I'm just believing that he told me the truth. Interesting stories. Sometimes I got a hold of an expert if I really thought that I needed to ask. Do you know Colin Harris? Yep, so he's become a really good friend. Well, I think he's a really good friend. He's probably going, oh, not her again. But anyway, I used to get in touch with him all the time and got him to read all the stuff about water. He checked for me. Okay. Now, the dialogues that I put in, I used them to put myself in there, which is not very journalistic, but just so that me and whoever I was talking to, sometimes we would chew the cud a little bit, you know, philosophize about things, and they went in the book as well. Now, a late inclusion in the book is my dialogue with John McDouall Stuart, and I'm so pleased I put that in. I wasn't going to, but I'm really pleased I did. And I can tell you that it's almost, when I'm talking about his expeditions, and he's talking about the risks that he took and things like that, it's coming from his journals. I haven't made that up. But what I have done is I've given him the Scots language, because he would have spoken like that, you know. I mean, we're all the same, aren't we? When you write, you get very posh, don't you? And you write very formally when you're writing, which he would have done in his journals. But when he was talking to me, he was speaking in Scots, and that's why in the book there's a glossary of some Scottish words. But I've a feeling that you probably can guess what the words mean in the context of the way that the dialogue's done. So, I fictionalised the conversations, but they're taken definitely from his journal. Now, the more personal chats, there wasn't an awful lot about him, because he never got married, never had children, didn't have a lot of friends, not a lot of letters from him to anybody or from other people to him. Not a lot, but we do know that he was a terrific bushman. People did write about what terrific skills he had out in the bush. People did also mention how tetchy he could be, and I can vouch for that. He came with me on the trip, and we didn't always get on, I can tell you. Now, I'm not totally crazy, so I know he didn't really come with me on the trip. So you all know that is definitely fiction, and I know that too, okay? Okay, now a fair bit has been written about his drinking habits. Whole essays on the subject, actually. And people who liked him would say, oh, poor man, the drink really got to him. People who didn't like him called him a terrible drunk. Now, do you recall at the beginning when I started talking, and I did mention that I may have had a couple of wines, when I decided on the title of my talk? Well, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I bet there's at least one or two of you out there that are going, well, she would, wouldn't she? She's Scottish. Because when I was telling people about McDouall Stuart, the people that did know he existed, they would go, a bit of a piss pot. I decided not to make a meal of that. I decided not to focus on that too much. I think his leadership skills and his fortitude and all of that. I do mention in the book that people said he was a bit of a piss pot. I didn't ignore that, but I didn't make a whole mountain out of it. That was my decision. I don't know. Maybe you could call me biased about that, or that I was, being a bit kind, but that's what I decided anyway. Now, it was a different story about his encounters with Aboriginal people on his expeditions. Particularly in South Australia, most of the people I spoke to, because they're all McDouall Stuart tragics like me and loved him, they would all say good things about him, okay? Now, Pete the Postie, I really did like Pete the Postie. I think probably because my dad was a postman. I think that's why I liked him. I met him up in Udnadatta. Now, Pete he used to travel from Coober to Udnadatta and out to some of the stations, and I think maybe down to William Creek. Anyway, he's a McDouall Stuart fan, and he used to take tourists in his van. And so I'm just going to read this little bit here. Pete is another McDouall Stuart fan and gives his passengers what he calls his Reader's Digest version of the man. And I'm quoting now. I tell them that Stuart recognised that the Aboriginal people lived out here and that the land belonged to them, Pete says. He wrote in his journals that they were the healthiest looking Indigenous people he had seen, fine strapping men. When they threatened him, rattling their spears, screaming and shouting, he'd say to his men something along the lines of, let them know that we have more firepower than them. Shoot the tree or the ground, but don't shoot the poor wretched men. After all, it is their land. Now, that's what Pete said. And I looked it up in the journals, and yeah, more or less, that's what the journals say. But it was a different story when I got to Alice Springs. Okay, so, and I think all of that, the people who say good things about him in South Australia, you had Skye Crickhoff here a couple of months ago talking about the frontier conflict and the map going up. And she was talking, I spoke to Skye as well when I was writing the book, and actually speaking to her gave me the courage to actually write a lot of what I wrote in the book, because she was saying that she comes from Hallett, I think, you know, it's in the outback, and she says she didn't know that Aboriginal people even lived on the land where her family. Can you still hear me? Yeah? You're going to really hear me in a minute, because I'm going to get this down. No, I'm not. I'm pulling in my earring, not this. Can you hear me now? Whoa! Is that too loud? Okay. Spoilt my hairstyle, goodness me. Okay, so we now know through Skye that there was conflict in South Australia, that Aboriginal people were there. When I came out 50 years ago, it was a common thing to say that everyone got on really well with everybody else, and actually there weren't very many Aboriginal people at all. But we now know better. So I'm thinking that perhaps some of those really rose-coloured stories about McDouall Stuart, possibly a little bit involved with that whole thing. I don't know. You might not agree with me. But anyway, it's a different story in Alice Springs, and I'm going to read a wee bit here. Now, how am I going for time? Running out? Okay. Right. Okay. Alice Springs. I'm at the halfway mark, okay? So I'll speed up a little bit. So in Alice Springs, I'm getting used to speaking to people, and they're all saying how wonderful John McDouall Stuart is. And then I get to Alice Springs and I meet this guy. Let me see where I've lost it. Cafe man. Okay. So he says to me, what are you doing? And I launch into my story. I'm following the tracks of John McDouall Stuart. And he looks at me and he says, don't expect a warm reception here. And I thought, what's he talking about? And he told me he'd been at a meeting a few years previously in Alice Springs protesting about the arrival of a statue of McDouall Stuart. So I wondered what that was all about. He mentioned a leaflet, and he said he reckoned that I was following the tracks of a mass murderer, is what he said. And I thought, what on earth is he talking about? Not someone you would choose to take you on the open road in the middle of nowhere, eh? He's got it all wrong, I decided. McDouall Stuart was keen to avoid conflict, and I still believe this. I agreed with those scribes who said that aggression wouldn't be in his best interests. After all, he was going to have to come back down the way he went up. It would be a bit silly for him to get into trouble. And it made sense. But have I been biased? Have I cherry-picked the information I wanted to find out? Maybe I'm the one who's got it all wrong. I'm not going to go into great detail there, but I left Alice Springs still none the wiser. And in the book, what I've done is, there's Pete the postie. That's the guy I interviewed. There's the statue of McDouall Stuart in Alice Springs, and that is what I put in the book. And what's around there are comments that I found that people said to me, or I found in the newspapers, very conflicting, all over the place. And so I left Alice Springs none the wiser and still very confused about what the truth was about McDouall Stuart. So then I got to Tennant Creek. And I thought, I still want to speak to somebody about this. What am I going to do? And you know what? I was so lucky. I got to Tennant Creek, and I'm still thinking about all those emotions dredged up in Alice Springs. May I say, because of the statue, not because of McDouall Stuart. In my view, that statue was put up at a time when people were pulling down colonial statues, and there was Alice Springs putting one up. It seemed like a very silly thing to do in my book, but of course that's what happened. So anyway, I get to Tennant Creek, and I want to speak to someone because it's very close to Attack Creek. For obvious reasons, that's where there was a conflict between McDouall Stuart and Aboriginal people. So I'm just going to read that very quickly, what this guy said to me. I didn't know who I was going to speak to. I didn't know how I was going to find someone, because in Alice Springs, no one would speak to me. And then, anyway, someone says, you should talk to Ross Williams. So he was in a TV documentary about the Overland Telegraph Line, and there's a scene about Attack Creek. He played the role of one of his warrior ancestors. I just thought, this is great. I can talk about the documentary and maybe avoid everything else. So this is Ross Williams. He said to me, we sat down, he said, my name is Ross Williams. I'm a Warramungu man. My skin name's Jacamara. My totem is the white cockatoo. Whenever I hear people talking like that, I feel really guilty. I know nothing about Scotland and nothing about Australia in terms of my connection to the land. We're propped on stools at a small round table in the beer garden out the back of the local pub, and I've got my tape recorder going. Okay, it's a few years now since Ross worked with historians in the making of the ABC TV documentary, A Wire Through the Heart. You've maybe seen it, and you can still get it on YouTube, about the construction of the Overland Telegraph Line. And this is what he said to me. For me and my nephews to have the chance to do that, to imagine what these old warriors were going through, it was an experience and a half, and a privilege too. To live through what our old people might have lived through, it makes you proud. I could just imagine what it would have been like for them warriors back then. Seeing my first white man and the horses, it would have been frightening, thinking, what am I going to do? Plus, they were letting the horses drink our water, the water that we own. That would have driven those old warriors to attack. They would have said, how come they think they have the right to do that? I'd have done the same thing in that situation. And then he said, and for McDouall Stuart and his men too, I would say they were panicking, seeing those spears flying, and they started firing back, I suppose. Yes, the whole thing would have been very hard. Shock on both sides, ignorance on both sides. And I just thought it just put my mind at rest it didn't put my mind at rest. I still grapple with it all. But I just thought I can continue on my travels now, you know. I'm not travelling with someone who is a bad man. It's just the times of the time. Now, I can stop here if you think that's enough. Shall I stop? Will I keep going or will I stop? Keep going a little bit. Okay, right, I just want to maybe mention two things. Burke and Wills, like I said I would. Now, this is what was in the Melbourne Punch about the great Australian exploration race, okay? So what we've got here is Burke on his lofty camel, and we've got McDouall Stuart on his puny little pony. Easy scene, this is a cartoon that Melbourne's produced in the Punch, okay? So they're trying to show that Burke and his expedition are superior to McDouall Stuart. Now, of course, they didn't leave at the same time. When Burke left Melbourne, McDouall Stuart was actually on his 4th expedition, and he was on his way back from his 4th expedition. And when McDouall Stuart got back to Adelaide, that's when the South Australian government suddenly decided they were going to fund his expeditions, because they didn't want Melbourne, they didn't want Victoria getting to the top first. Because at that point, South Australia was the first port of call with ships, with news from the old country. And the Overland Telegraph Line, of course, was going to take over from that. And so South Australia decided that they wanted to make sure that McDouall Stuart reached the top, and so they started to fund his 5th and 6th expedition. Now, McDouall Stuart, and I have him with me in the van, and he tells me that there was no race as far as he was concerned. He didn't care about a race at all. And in fact, on his 5th expedition, he'd no idea where Burke and Wills had got to, because they'd already left. They could have got to the top as far as he knew, but he called a creek after Burke. He called it Burke's Creek, he says. Now, would I do that about somebody that I was trying to beat to the top? Actually, Burke and Wills were already dead by then, but no one knew that. Anyway, McDouall Stuart comes back down on the 5th expedition. He still hadn't got to the top. He's not going to chance his men, you know. He's not interested in that. He just wants to get to the top, but he wants all his men to live. So he came down. Burke and Wills are still, people are getting a wee bit worried about them, but they came down, and the South Australian media, this is what they said. I've typed this up. Exploration of the interior. Triumphant journey of Mr. Stuart. The continent of Australia has been crossed. It hadn't been crossed. He hadn't got to the top. And McDouall Stuart said, no, I've got to go back out again. I've got to get to the top. And so he went out again. And he was determined that he was going to get to the top. But the reason that the South Australian media, of course, said that was because they were trying to bolster everything up and fire everybody up and make sure that the government gave them more money to get to the top. So don't believe everything you read in the newspapers. Okay. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is this book. And I'll keep this to the end because I think you might send me packing when I tell you what I'm going to say about this. We of the Never Never. It's a load of bunkum. Absolutely. I know it's a classic, and I know it was taught in the schools and all of that, but it is a load of nonsense. And actually, I don't think, what's her name? Ghan. I don't think she ever pretended that it was anything more than her rose-coloured glasses view of 1 year. That's all she was up there at Elsie Station, 1 year. So, you know, how much could she really tell? And being a woman in those days, how much would she know about what was going on? I just want to read you a little bit about what Philip Adams had to say about that. Okay, Philip Adams. Because Philip Adams actually was the executive producer of the movie that was made of the book. Okay? So this is what he said. Now, I've got here that the film was generally panned for being sanitized, sentimental, and stereotypical. Okay? So Philip Adams describes the movie as a Disney-fied distortion of a distortion. That's what he said. I dimly thought it might be useful to make a film from the book which gave some recognition to Aborigines in Australia, he said. I remember the book as being progressive in attitudes for its time. When I belatedly read the damn thing, my blood froze because I realised that it was infinitely patronising. It's amazing how things changed over the years, isn't it? I regret that the movie, was ever made, and of course wouldn't touch it with a barge pole were the proposal to be brought to me today. I had to put that in. Now, I went to Mataranka. The movie remains, to this day, even although, we all know that it's a lot of nonsense, the movie remains on a constant loop in a replica of the original homestead at Mataranka, giving tourists a full dollop of fake history. Near the replica homestead is an artificial spring kept at a constant 34 degrees Celsius to make the tourists more comfortable. And a talking termite mound is within walking distance. How much falseness can one tourist spot conjure up? Anyway, I'm going to end there, and I just want to say, as I was saying to these ladies down at the front, I'm off to Scotland in August, and I'm going back to my hometown in Kirkcaldy. Waterstones is stocking my book, and I'm giving 3 talks in my hometown. So I just feel that that's going to round it all off for me, my whole thing about McDouall Stuart. Seriously, 10 years. I think it's about time I stopped stalking them, don't you? Really, I'll have to move on to something else. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going back to Scotland. It'll be interesting to hear what they think about it. Thank you very much.